I'm showing 12:15 here according to the Microsoft Surface clock. So why don't we go ahead and get things started? I think we'll have some other folks that'll be joining us as we go, but we're going to respect your time and get things going. My name's Ed Robertson. I am Director of Business Development for JourneyTEAM and one of your moderators for this session. Today we're going to be covering how to drive proper Microsoft Teams adoption. And you've got the guru of gurus who's going to be steering the ship as we move through this hour. So a little bit of housekeeping as we get started. Basically, what's going to be going on for the folks that are here and the folks that aren't going to be here. This session is being recorded, and we'll make it available to attendees after the fact. There'll be some editing, obviously, that'll take place, but we'll get that out to you. If you haven't realized it thus far, you're muted. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat, and we'll be responding to those in real time, as well as compiling those for later follow-up as well. If you are having connection problems, audio, video, bandwidth, whatever, if you can, let us know in the chat and or go directly to support@journeyteam.com, and they can work with you in the background to get anything squared away that's within our power to get squared away. As I mentioned to some of the folks that joined early, I'll be dropping a link to a survey into the chat window. So sometime before, during, well, not before, but during or after the session, ideally after the session, we would love for you to complete that survey, give us some feedback. We're also going to throw a shameless bribery into that process. We're going to be having a drawing for a $50 Amazon gift card to the folks in this session that fill out that survey and get it back to us. Added bonus is that filling out that survey also puts you into a drawing overall for a brand spanking new Microsoft Surface Sapphire. Surface Pro 9 is the latest and greatest version of the Surface family. So housekeeping aside, maybe we can talk a little bit about JourneyTEAM. Who the heck are we? Well, at the top of that, a few stats about JourneyTEAM. One thing I'll add, an update, is that we are actually about 160 plus team members. We have been blessed over the last several years with some pretty substantial growth to support the clients and the projects that we've been working on. That means we've got right now, over the last 12 months, have added over 350 active customers into that mix. JourneyTEAM's been around for about 29 years. We're based in Draper, Utah, but we've got operations throughout the United States in Texas, Tennessee, California, up in the Northeast in the Boston area, and we support customers and projects throughout the United States, with even a few outside of the United States as well. We pride ourselves on our relationships and doing good work for the folks that trust us with their business processes. So we have currently 90+% referenceable customers, and that is a work in progress always to drive that as close to 100% as we can. We've got, over the last 5 years, we completed 1,300 plus projects across the realm of what JourneyTEAM does as a Microsoft partner and a systems integrator. It's always kind of weird to hear this coming from a sales guy, so I'm going to let you hear it from some other folks out there in the community, some of the awards. JourneyTEAM is part of what Microsoft calls the Inner Circle. And as of last year, the Inner Circle is literally the top, I think, 1% of Microsoft partners in the world. To put that into perspective, Microsoft literally has tens of thousands of partners worldwide. So we are honored to be part of that crew, and that's a designation that comes from Microsoft, not us thumping ourselves on the back. We have been Microsoft Partner of the Year for 2 years, and that puts us once again. That feedback comes from input from our clients who feed that into Microsoft, as well as the folks that we interface with at Microsoft. We like to think it's a pretty cool place to work as well. The folks that have been there, I've been with JourneyTEAM almost 7 years. Kip's pretty darn close to that. He's got his own story that he'll share there, but we've been recognized by the state of Utah and then also nationally as one of the better places to work. And I can attest to that. It's a pretty cool place, but you heard that from me. A little bit about JourneyTEAM. We call this slide lovingly our honeycomb slide, but it really does, I think, a pretty good job of covering the range of what JourneyTEAM provides as a business consulting group. We cover literally the entire Microsoft Enterprise solution system or solution set. Our practices cover ERP, CRM, our cloud, and in that ERP world, that is the Microsoft Dynamics ERP solution set. Both the on-prem versions of that, as well as the modern cloud-based versions of Dynamics 365. Our mid-market solution, which is the Business Central, as well as the large enterprise solution, which is Finance and Supply Chain, formerly known as F&O, formerly known as AX. But you have that. On the CRM side of things, the Dynamics 365 solution set, we cover that from sales, customer engagement, customer service, marketing, field service, project service automation, really the full suite of what it is that Microsoft does to help you with your customer journey. The cloud team covers the Microsoft Modern Workplace solution set. That's your Office 365, Microsoft 365, Teams, which Kip's going to dive into in great deal of detail, as well as the security side of what goes on in your environment. So identity and access management, endpoint security, device management, remote device management, things like that. Collaboration and content is, once again, that's Kip's baby. He's going to dive into that into more detail, but that's information architecture, knowledge management, intranet architecture, design and deployment, and the thing we all know and love, SharePoint, and all things related to that. Our data and BI practice really focuses on the Microsoft Power Platform. So that's Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, data warehousing, and really all those things related to taking all of that data that your business generates and turning that into actionable insights from an analytics perspective. One of the things we've learned as a practice over the years is that the technology, as deployed, tends to work as advertised. Where organizations tend to struggle sometimes, though, is with the adoption of the change that comes along with technology. So we actually have a practice and an overlay that really works with all of those other areas to help address the people side of technology. Nobody's buying technology for the sake of technology. You're looking to solve problems. But we also realize that not everybody is in the same place at the same time with respect to adoption, training, culture, and all of those things that go along with meeting you where you are and getting you to where you want to go from an adoption and change management perspective. So a little bit of an overview of what JourneyTEAM is all about. But, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kip and let him take you down the road here. Let's see, Kip.
Let's go ahead and get started. You got me now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to launch a poll really quick. We'll just get an idea of where everyone's at from a Teams adoption perspective. As I do an intro, if you guys want to fill out that poll, it should be in your screen, or you can pull up the chat message and see the poll there. I mostly wanted to get a pulse of what does your guys' Microsoft Teams adoption look like today. And the last option there is, hey, we're not using Teams yet, right? And that's valuable for me to know as well. So if that's the case for you guys, please select appropriately, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So feel free to fill out that poll, and let's kind of see where we're looking at. So far, it's looking like 38% of us are just okay, 15% around great and good, and then we do have probably a few people with not using Teams and not great at all. So great. Okay, that's excellent. That's good to know. So a little quick intro about me. Kip Sorensen, I'm the practice director over that collaboration content management team. My specialty has been in business and IT consulting for almost about 16 years of my career. So I am pretty much a consultant for the majority of my life, other than a few years working with Intel and Micron and for the Department of Defense. I have seen a huge portfolio and arrangement of projects across the board. Everything from organizations that are a small mom and pop shop of 10 employees to organizations over 30,000, as well as global SharePoint farms that kind of span the entire world, and somehow trying to make those work together, despite geographic latency issues that used to come with on-prem SharePoint. And that's a whole other bag that we can talk about, all the new things that are available to us that used to be so difficult to do that are substantially easier to do nowadays that we're in SharePoint Online. So let's really get into this topic of how do we drive proper Microsoft Teams adoption. Now, the reality of it is when we meet with clients across multiple verticals and industries, their Teams adoption is kind of something similar to this, right? It's there, right? And in fact, we could almost even say, Kip, we don't have a problem with Teams getting adopted at all. In fact, out of all the clients I've worked with, this has never been a problem. This is never a problem, actually getting Teams adoption. Getting proper Teams adoption, that's what we're going to focus on today, because Microsoft has done a great job on this product. It's amazing. And I don't even mind hopping into the subject of how there's not a product like it, right? We have a tendency to sometimes compare Teams to, let's say, Slack or to Zoom, but there is no comparison to what Microsoft Teams is. And that's why I think that when we roll out Teams within organizations, we don't have to force our users to start using Teams. They use Teams because it's effective and it's useful. Now, the drawback is the things that get in our way is IT and the business not being intentional around our Teams rollout. And then we end up with something like this, right? Where in this example, in this server room with these switches, data's happening, right? Things are probably working pretty well. However, man, it could be so much better, right? And we could get more Teams adoption. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is established on the premise that we don't have an information access problem. We are officially in the information age, if we're not all aware of it. And the problem is not, hey, Kip, I can't find the data that I need. That's not the problem. The problem is there's too much data, right? The problem is I'm seeing things that aren't relevant to what I need to do. I'm getting information overload, and the inefficiency is not that the data is not there. It's I'm not being able to get to the right data at the right time when I need it, which is pretty much the summary of what is knowledge management, right? It's access to the right data at the right time, or the right person, to be frank. And so we want to look from that lens, look at a Teams adoption from that perspective. How do we roll this out in a way that it's effective and employees aren't getting noise around the content that we have? And unfortunately, a standard Teams adoption generates a lot of noise. And so we want to eliminate that and focus on getting the right information to the right people. Now, what a common Teams adoption look like, if I had to summarize this, based upon our experience, is, most organizations don't restrict the ability for users to create teams. So we've offsetted the responsibility of teams creation and classification to the user base. Now, the irony is If I don't have access to a team, do I know about it? And in most cases, the answer is no. But yet I have the ability to provision a team. Well, then I don't know if that team already exists, right? So we need to work through that. Second, most users are not strategically creating teams, right? They're not looking at it at a 30,000 view or org-wide level view and saying, how do we organize our data? They're focused in what? My job, what I need to do to accomplish, and I'm not thinking outside of that. And so I'm not in a position to strategically be provisioning collaboration spaces. Most users don't know what teams already exist, right? Because they don't have access. And teams ownership is often managed by the business groups. During offboarding, how do we get users to the content they need to when they get onboarded into the organization? Or how do we clean that up? The other thing is most organizations aren't restricting guest access to their team's environment, which is a major security hole. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. And then there's nuances about the technology that we just don't know, right? I mean, if we had to summarize knowledge, right? It's we have knowledge, we know what we don't know, we know what we know, and then there's a huge chunk of that knowledge that we don't know what we don't know it. And that is the value that Journey Team brings to the table is we've been through the reps, right? And so we know the things that you should know when it comes to implementing an adoption strategy around Microsoft Teams. So let's get into how do we do this, Kip, or how do we architect teams correctly? And I really broke this down into a few distinctions that I want to call out. So distinction number one is we need to establish the difference between collaboration and publishing. So another kind of quick, fun poll, if you guys don't mind, because this is, I don't know, maybe I'm enjoying this a little bit too much. So thumbs up or thumbs down when I open up this poll, who has exposure to file servers and mapped drives? Because I get that that's a generational thing and I might be dating myself a little bit, but give me some quick pulse if you know what, when I say a mapped drive, what that means. All right, 100% so far. Okay, good. We haven't, nothing personal. We have an older generation listening. Or you work for organizations that have older tech. Okay, so this is perfect. So when we talk about map drives, if you guys remember, or if you're experiencing it today, we had different drive letters that represented different types of content, right? There was never a drive letter and it's like, well, all data in S drive. We didn't do that, right? What we ended up doing is we would say, oh, well, S drive is the shared drive, and anything in the shared drive, the entire company had access to maybe, right? Or it was read-only access. And then we would set up the P drive, and the P drive was my personal storage. And then we might take up an H drive, and anything in the H drive was my department's secure data. And my H drive in the IT department was different than the H drive in the HR department or in finance or etc. Right? I bring this up because that is a poor man's version of information architecture knowledge management. We did that. Why? Because that drive letter ended up having meaning around it. We taught our users from an adoption perspective that when you see H, that meant secure department data. When you saw P, that meant individual personal cloud storage. When you saw S, that was shared. So we created distinctions around that level of content. The same thing needs to happen within Microsoft 365. When we move data up to Microsoft 365, the data is not all created equal, and they have distinctions and uniqueness around them. So, and the most common classification of that is between that of collaboration content and that of publishing. So let me just talk to these just super briefly because those words pretty much explain it fairly well. But what is publishing content? That's intranet content, right? We publish the content for the dissemination of our employees. So that's typically a company portal, an intranet of some sort. It's typically corporate approved. It's one directional, read only, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Versus collaboration is us getting our jobs done. So the permanent example of these two would be, let's say, an employee handbook from an HR department. The working version of the employee handbook, and the draft Word version of it is where? Collaboration. When that handbook gets done and now we're ready to publish V3, where do we put V3? In the company's intranet over into publishing. We have two versions of this document, the working copy within in HR's collaboration space, and then we have the published version of the employee handbook possibly sitting on the company's intranet. We need to make that distinction. Why? Because we need to architect teams appropriately. Okay, let me take this one step further and then we'll hop specifically right into teams. Oh, and I'm kind of in the way here, so bear with me. So when we look at a Microsoft 365 ecosystem, we'll typically break it down into these categories. Okay, we'll break them down into organizational content and communication. That big circle in the bottom left, that is your company's intranet. Broad communication, templates and forms, global search, people search, profiles, event calendars, etc., KPIs, dashboards, all that kind of jazz. Down the middle, we have individual storage and personal cloud storage. If you haven't figured that out yet, that's OneDrive. It's not meant for collaboration. It's actually meant for individual cloud storage. I will argue with you until I'm blue in the face that that's the proper use for it. Love to share some ideas there. Moving up at the top, we have cold storage and non-collaborative content. I will be probably the first SharePoint consultant you'll ever hear of that will say not all data belongs in SharePoint. It certainly doesn't. And why? Because if we have non-relevant data sitting inside of a SharePoint ecosystem, it goes back to what I said earlier. What are we doing? We're creating noise, non-relevant content that I don't need to have access to. Okay. And we can even get into the whole conversation about how even referenceable content should probably be rated and exposed appropriately, right? Why would you ever reference content that you don't want your employees to use if it's like bad data or lowly rated content, especially when we talk about project data or historical data for organizations that have projects and things like that. Moving over to the right, we have collaboration. And that's where we're going to focus our attention today, is in that dark blue box around collaboration departments and groups. We'll focus there. But I do want to call this out before we get into that, that there is this need for ad hoc collaboration. And we don't need to make a team for it all the time. So if I'm collaborating with Ed and Kevin on an Excel spreadsheet that we need to be working on, does that justify a team? Or can I just do a group chat and share a file, right? So we don't want to over engineer our environment and create even more noise by collaborating groups around everything. So there is a balance there. But once again, I want to just call out these unique distinctions, and where our focus today is going to be around collaborative departments and groups. And that's our focus, because I think that is the primary use case around a team's adoption. Okay. Now, once again, I'll keep the chat open, guys, on my screen. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to put those in, and I'll address them on the fly as I see those come up. I think we have a small enough group that I can do that without disrupting the flow of the conversation. Okay. All right, let's move on. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so Jason, good question. I hope you discuss, and in the document library, members can share with people outside their department. It's confusing when to use a team versus share cross department out of a document library. Great point. And we'll hopefully we'll get to that, Jason. And if not, kind of remind me, and I'll make the distinction of when do we share versus something else, right? But I kind of want to explain the something else before we rat hole on the cross departmental sharing. Okay. All right. So let's get into distinction number 2, limiting the control and the provisioning of Microsoft Teams. Now, this is such a problem. And I have a solution that we've done, that we use here at JourneyTEAM to address this. But regardless of whether it's our tooling or another third-party vendor, you need to address this issue. I cannot explain how many times that we've been brought in with a firm where they go, hey, we haven't rolled out Teams yet. And so we're trying, we're doing this properly, we're planning. And then we go look inside their tenant and they have thousands of teams. By default, without any unique configurations on your part, any user within your environment, within your tenant, will have the ability to provision a team with no elevated permissions being granted to them. Now, here's the other irony is a standard user has 11 ways for them to create a collaborative space. I think maybe 2 of the 11 logically make sense. The other 9, the user has no idea what they're doing. And it's usually by accident that they're actually provisioning collaborative spaces, okay? IT admins have 22 ways to provision these spaces. And ironically enough, depending on how a collaborative space gets provisioned, different things and switches will be turned on and off within your tenant. So here's my recommendation, and we'll dive into this, don't worry. But here's my recommendation. You need to determine for your organization, is it productive for you to allow users to create collaborative spaces or not? And if it's not, you need to turn off this spigot. Now, I understand that there's a balance here, right? We have some clients that are over 50,000 users. We can't turn off users' ability to provision collaboration. Why? Because IT doesn't have the staff to handle the overhead of funneling the requests. And principle here, what happens when IT governs too tightly or doesn't provide a needed service to the business? Users find a way, right? They hop online, they start using Box, they start using Google, like they'll use another tool because they need to get their jobs done. So there is a balance here around us giving them the tools they need, but us doing it in a way that's effective for the organization and secure for your guys' data set. Now, some of you might be a little confused with the fact that I'm saying collaborative groups or collaborative spaces, and I'm not saying teams. And the reason why is this conversation is a little bit broader than just a teams conversation. And so let me attempt to illustrate that briefly and quickly here. So let me give you an example and full credit. This resource actually comes, I stole this from Jump to 365. That's an online resource. These guys make some great infographics, really good content. This is probably the best graphic that explains this scenario. So let me give you an example. So before I walk through this, when I say collaboration, this is what I'm saying. I am saying that you have what we call a Microsoft 365 security group on the back end that manages the membership of that security group, right? That security group is then connected to Microsoft Teams. It's connected to SharePoint. It's connected to Forms workspaces. It's connected to Planner for task management. It's connected to Stream for work group videos. It's connected to Exchange for a mailbox, to a calendar, Project for the web, and there's probably more. And even if those were the full list, it's going to just increase. So for instance, even Project for the web, when it first got released by Microsoft, it wasn't 365 group based. It is now. And the reason why is we don't want to manage permissions across 10 systems. The idea is that I establish a collaborative group that may represent, let's say, a department. And once I'm a member of that department, what do I have access to? The array of tools that make up collaboration. We're no longer talking about document storage. We're talking about secure chat. We're talking about a team calendar. We're talking about document management. We're talking about an Exchange mailbox. We're talking about these other things that make up this realm of collaboration. And document storage is actually just one aspect of collaboration. Now, with that said, let me give you an example what exists today in your tenant if you haven't locked anything down, right? So if you follow me here, follow one of the top boxes, and let's say let's all follow along visually here, and let's go with Planner. So you navigate to Planner within your Microsoft 365 tenant, and you go create the button that says New Plan. From there, and I don't think it's very intuitive, a user could accidentally create a 365 group. Now, what will happen, and we've seen it numerous times, as the user goes there and they'll go to Plan and they'll go, oh, planner, it's task management. I understand what this is. And so they'll create a plan and they'll call their plan Kip's to-do list, right? Then they'll hit create plan. What happens on the back end? Forms workspace gets created. SharePoint site collection gets created. A OneNote notebook inside the SharePoint site collection gets created. If we didn't change configs, or depending on our configurations, a Power BI workspace gets provisioned. The plan I asked for gets made. Stream. And then I actually get an Exchange mailbox, an Exchange calendar called Kip's to-do list at JourneyTEAM.com. All that happened because me as an innocent user had no idea what I was provisioning. And thus the reason for us managing this. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of these are self-explanatory, right? A user creates a team. You kind of assume that they understand that they're making a department or a collaborative group. But like I said, there's 11 ways for a user to do this. Most users don't realize what's actually happening on the back end. So we need to address this. So let me give you an example of some tooling that we have used in JourneyTEAM. And this isn't like a pitch for our tool. If you're interested in it, great. But if you're not using a tool, you need to find a tool. So let me give you an example. So within JourneyTEAM, here's a tool that we've created called Team Hub. And what Team Hub does is, and if you look at the navigation here at the very top, it says My Teams. Here's all the teams I belong to within our organization. And that drop-down filter on the left allows me to navigate in between our teams. And we'll get to that here in a second, okay? If I want to provision a team, I navigate over to the top navigation that says Team Request. And now I can say, I want to create, let's say, a client team. And now I can ask questions that teams will never ask me out of the box. I could say, well, who's this for? What's the client code? Do you want a notebook? Do you want a plan automatically provisioned? Do we want an Exchange mailbox to be created? Like, we can funnel this process, and even for some of our clients, instigate an approval process as part of the request. Okay. So once again, in summary, you have really three things that I would for you to consider. One, you keep Teams creation wide open and you trust your users to kind of know what they're doing. High probability is it's going to get a little out of control, right? And IT could take a reactionary approach to that and say, hey, this team just got provision, and then go talk to the business and decommission it if necessary. Option number two is turn off the spigot and say, hey, users, you don't get to create these collaborative groups whenever you want, because most of the time you have no idea that what you're doing. You need to put an IT ticket in and we're going to create them for you. Or the third, look for some type of tooling such as this to manage the process of the creation. Okay. All right, let's move on to our next distinction, which is really around structured collaboration versus unstructured collaboration. Okay. Now, let me pose this question to you guys. What does this look like today for you? So, and if you don't mind, rapid fire in the chat, give me examples. And I'm trying not to taint you guys with my opinion here, right? So give me examples of collaborative groups within your organizations, right? And I'll say the first one, that's a no-brainer, a department, right? So what other collaborative groups exist within your company? I'm going to just wait until you guys start chatting. So, okay, we've got projects. Love it. Budget discussions. Project manager with developers. Strategic planning. I love it. Steering committees. Good. Any more? Projects. Good. Purchasing. Sales group. Procedures. Dispatching. Offices. Geographic offices. Good point, Ron. IT is another department. David. Yeah, that's good. Executive management. Exactly. And here's the deal. I sometimes get clients that will say, well, Kip, what should the groups be? The groups should be what your culture calls them. Within JourneyTEAM, we have the distinction of battle teams. So we use that verbiage, right? We have communities for social interest groups. We have projects. We have client spaces. We have departments, and etc. Right? And we want to latch on to what your culture and your organization does today to drive the user adoption and the quote unquote classifications of teams appropriately. So here's some examples, right? Structured versus unstructured. Now, you know, and I don't think Ed's going to give you an Amazon gift card for this, but challenge in the chat anyway. Any guesses why I make this distinction between structured and unstructured? Any guesses? Metadata, life cycle, yes. Internal versus internal. So life cycle is part of it, right? Unstructured is short term. Yes. External. Yes, this is perfect. Okay. Structured is tied to something. In essence, we should never have a user saying, hey, IT, I need to spin up a department space. Okay, I don't know how many IT people I have on the call, but if you have a user asking you to provision a department space, you are failing as an IT department. Let's be frank, right? We should know what departments exist within our environments. And we should even be taking the necessary action to make those before they're being actually requested from the business. Okay. So structured is kind of more formalized. They're structured to the organization, and there shouldn't be any sprawl in that space of structure. And I'll get into more of the benefits here, but what does that look like for some of our clients, right? Departments, obviously, fire teams, functional groups, circles for those crazy organizations that have like functional groups based on circles, geographic divisions, etc. Examples of unstructured, AKA where sprawl might happen. And back to, I think it was Kristen's point, where we might life cycle these differently, right? So a committee, for instance, or a community, let's use a community as an example. So if we utilize Teams or Yammer, and by the way, what does Yammer use? 365 groups, okay? But let's say we use a community and it's a rock climbing group. Well, if that is unused and goes inactive, the life cycle of that is get rid of it. It's noise. But we're never going to do that with a department, right? We may never do that with a project per se. Or at JourneyTEAM, we create project spaces. The project's over, we decommission it, right? So there's a unique life cycle to some of these. Now, the other thing that someone mentioned earlier was external, and we'll get into that. And I have a feeling, Kyle, you're jumping ahead, man. But nonetheless, there's unstructured sprawl, and this is where growth happens. And this is where our departments should be asking for new teams. They should never be asking for teams underneath the grouping of structured. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. And we're going to start tying some of these things together. Okay. Ed, I don't know if you're unmuted. What's our time window? I have a tendency to talk maybe a little too much. So
We are we're good until 15 after.
1:15. Okay. All right. I'll haul through this and then we can address some immediate questions as well, guys. Okay. All right. So what are the things, Kip, that we should be thinking about when we provision teams, right? And let me go back actually to that previous slide. Let's assume that in your environment, you are using these quote unquote distinctions and classifications. Is the tech any different between an initiative, a committee, a department, a division, or a workspace? No, it's all teams. It's 365 groups and teams. The technology is exactly the same. So why do we make the distinctions? Because we might want to configure them slightly different so that life cycle is different and the provisioning process is different based upon its classification. Okay, let me give you an example. So let's look through some of these configs. First config option that's available to you guys. And don't worry, I'll have a summary of this on another slide and then we can open it up for questions. First, membership type, dynamic versus assigned. Dynamic 365 groups, you have the ability to auto assign people to a security group based upon properties in Active Directory. Simplest example, if department on my Active Directory profile is equal to human space resources, I am automatically added to the HR 365 security group. Onboarding, done. All that IT had to do is create my identity. And now all of a sudden, I'm in the team for HR. Now, remember what I said earlier. It's not just the team for HR, right? Because that 365 group that serves up the membership for HR is addressing access to task management and planner and project for the web. It's giving me access to the files I need within SharePoint. I'm being added to the mailbox, the team calendar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can do that for structured collaboration. Why? Because we know what structured departments exist in our org, so we can set them up to be dynamic. Doing dynamic for that unstructured collaboration is next to impossible, right? So the option assigned is the owner of that team or that 365 group manages the permission set. Now, if you guys haven't already figured this out, this is kind of Microsoft's approach here. Let the business manage themselves. I don't know ultimately if some employee should have access to some committee, right? Let them figure that out on their own. We can have a committee chair that manages the permissions. When they want to add Ed to the committee, the person in charge of the committee can add Ed, right? And they don't have to have IT intervention to manage the membership. Okay, so assigned is the business manages the permission on their own. Dynamic, users are automatically assigned to a 365 group based upon properties within Active Directory. Quick disclaimer, not all properties in Active Directory can be used for dynamic configurations. Okay, I can get you that content if you're looking for that. Second, group privacy, public or private. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but I'll make it fairly quick. Let's first talk about teams. If a team is provisioned and the group privacy is set to public, that means anyone can join that team. So I can see the team. So if I see the rock climbing team, I can go to teams, I can see it, and I can join. Okay. If the rock climbing team was private, I can't join it. Okay. Now, yeah, so sorry, I'll read that question here in a second. On the SharePoint side, and anyone that's concerned about SharePoint permissions, please listen up right now because this is super, super critical. As we all know, when a team gets made, there's a SharePoint site that gets created with it. If that team is public, by default on the SharePoint side, all authenticated users have add, edit, and delete access to the SharePoint site, whether they're a member of the 365 group or not. Major security risk, okay? Major problem, possible dilemma. Thus, a general statement being made by me here, everything should be private except for probably social interest community groups. Other than that, they should all be private. You should be very careful in regards to when we use public. Okay. Question in the chat. Jaron, can notifications be set up to alert IT when a new team is created? Yes, you can. So MCAS has changed. It's a different name, Purview, I don't know, something. But you could set up different, actually, you could even set up some Power Automate flows by reading logs. You can use MCAS to be able to do like a retroactive alert process of when teams are created. So then that way you can manage them that way. So you do have some tooling as well as third-party tooling too, Jaron, in regards to what you can do there. Okay. All right, identity. Another distinction I want to create here because we'll talk about it later. You have users at JourneyTEAM, and I'm going to call that an internal user. If we're doing work, let's say with Ron Smiley, and Ron, we're engaged with you, we may set up a team and invite you as a guest within our tenant. What that does is we're not paying for a license for Ron for that to occur. And Ron We're not even managing the authentication method for Ron. Ron's still authenticating against Microsoft 365. And then he has the ability to have guest access within our environment and actually collaborate with us. In fact, in that example, Ron can chat in the thread. He can modify documents. He can access Planner. He can even have a view only state with no licensing, a project for the web. He's collaborating. By the way, this is such a great feature. On-prem SharePoint, this was like next impossible to do. And Microsoft has made this so we can externally collaborate with users in a very easy way. So think of guests as when I invite you from your org to have access into our environment. Now, I'll talk about how we should manage that here shortly, okay? Oh, I chose the wrong person as an analogy because Ron's like, well, I'm in a GCC tenant, so he must be government. Ron, you're in a restricted world of Microsoft 365, so all this fun stuff is probably not applicable to you anyway. So, just kidding, but a dilemma nonetheless, actually, for GCC tenants. Okay, let me keep going here. So, sensitivity labels. You guys have the ability. Let me pause. Most of you, when you hear sensitivity labels, you're thinking the classification of records and or emails, right? So Microsoft has this amazing technology. I can take a label and let's say create a label called highly confidential, and I can deploy it within our environment, and I can flag like an email as highly confidential, or I can even flag documents as highly confidential. And there's a bunch of cool stuff that happens on the back end. And this is in the realm of sensitivity labels. Things like if I classify a document as highly confidential, for instance, and then I take that file and I put it on a thumb drive and give it to Kevin Zollinger, he could take that thumb drive, go home, plug it in his home computer, go to open the document, and he has to authenticate to open the document, and the document's encrypted. So it secures the document, encrypts it, and causes him to phone home to authenticate before opening. Things like that, or even like watermarks on documents, super cool stuff. Now, that same tech, Microsoft has allowed us to create labels for 365 groups and SharePoint sites. So back to that previous slide with these classifications, what that means is that when we can deploy group sensitivity labels, and when users go create a team, or when IT creates a team, we can classify them. We can say that this team is a department, that this team is a project, that this team is a committee or a community. And then that classification gives IT the power to treat them differently, whether it's lifecycle management or just overhead and understanding what is what. And I'll kind of get into the nuances there, but it's at the root of our ability to properly drive classifications within Microsoft Teams and within collaboration. Another setting, hide from address list. Some of you guys might be looking at this previous list and go, well, Kip, what, a committee, a committee doesn't need all that collaboration stuff, right? Maybe they don't need an Exchange mailbox for email distribution. Maybe they don't need a team calendar. Like that's overkill, right? And I agree. Like we work on so many projects, like Ed was alluding to in our early slides, like 350 projects this year. Can you imagine what our Exchange mailbox would look like if there's an email address for every one of those projects? Noise, right? So one of the settings that we can set within the 365 group is hide from address list. We don't want the Exchange mailbox to show up in the company's address list because no one's going to use it. So we can set that to no. Okay. Subscribe members. Here's the rub. You can't get a 365 group without an Exchange mailbox. So the question is, it's a little bit of a smoke and mirrors. We can hide it so no one knows about it. And now there's this whole kind of side conversation around that mailbox is a unique mailbox, just like we've probably seen in the past, where I can navigate to that mailbox and see emails, if that makes sense. If I subscribe the members of the 365 group to the mailbox will act like a distribution list. So now when you email finance@accounting.com, if all the members are subscribed to it, they will just get an email in their personal mailboxes like it's a distribution list, right? And so that's the power of subscribing members to a 365 group. Just kind of keep in mind there's like nuances here. Sometimes it makes sense not to do this. Sometimes it makes sense to do it. So just kind of think through that thought process. And then the last thing that I want to share right there is external access. This can be tied to the sensitivity label. This is one of the features currently that we can do on a label. So I can set up a label and say, we can configure our 365 tenant, I should say, to not allow guests in our tenant. Remember what I was talking about earlier. Guest is someone outside of our environment internally collaborating with us. We may not want to turn that on across the board. Why? Because users don't know sometimes, right, what they're doing. And so a user in finance could think that they're sharing a file with someone and invite someone outside of our organization to be a member of the finance security group. Possible dilemma, yes? So if we turned off guest access within our 365 tenant, we do have the ability, though, to say, hey, whenever a 365 group or a team is provisioned and it's classified this way, then we will allow external access. And that's how we bucket, how we expose the environment appropriately. So, and I think I have an example for you guys here. Let me jump around here as an example. I'll have an example. So really, let me pause for a second. Questions on these configurations, and I think I do have one in the chat. If you have other questions, put them in right now if you don't mind. The question from Brett is, can sensitivity labels give us more control on who can access what in SharePoint, such as a department has a SharePoint site, but not everyone in that department should be able to access individual folders within SharePoint? Yeah, that's a good question. So Brett, the sensitivity labels right now pretty much does two things for us. It classifies them. So theoretically, you can run some PowerShell scripts and say, do X to all sites that are classified as X, right? The other thing it does for us is we can not allow guest access in our tenant, and then based upon the label, allow guest access. That's really all it does today. Now, with that said, probably more than 6 months ago, a year ago, this wasn't even sensitivity labels. This used to be just called classifications, and it did none of that other stuff. So I'm envisioning that more and more these group labels will come with more meat in regards to configurations. Now, Brett, part of your question is, can I have a label that only allows access to sub things? And this is a perfect segue into my recommendation to you guys. In an ideal state, I'm a member of a team or I'm not, period. If you guys can do that in your environments, you are like ahead of the game, and that is the ideal state. And I know that's disruptive, right? Because in the past, what did we do? Permission hell everywhere, right? File server, oh, this group has sub access to this subfolder, whatever, right? And then the minute you come to us and you say, hey, we need to migrate all those files to SharePoint, we're like, well, who has access to what? And it requires this massive spreadsheet and hours to try to reverse engineer what we've done on a permission level. In an ideal world, we say we have a group called HR. If I'm a member of the HR team, I'm a member of the HR team. And if I need access to some other area of sub HR and I'm not part of HR, the answer is no, period. We don't disinherit permissions at a library level and a folder level and below that and below that. And the reason why is the conversation is bigger than files. See, that works on files, right? But remember, a 365 group is a group membership for what? Collaboration. So does that sub person need to have access to Planner, the Exchange mailbox, the team calendar? Like, it's so much more. And Microsoft's approach here is you're a member of the team or you're not a member of the team. Now, everyone might be like yelling on the other side of this presentation going, well, Kip, it's not that simple, right? We have cross-departmental collaboration happening. We have these other things that where people in other groups are working with one another. And this is a good segue into one of the questions that came up earlier. Okay. So let's move on to that to address those concerns. So let's just jump here. So let me give you an example. Here's an example of a basic Teams architecture for one of our clients. Okay, so what we said is when we talk about collaboration for this client, this is how everything's configured. So let me walk through these briefly. A department, pretty straightforward. We don't need to talk about that much more. Community of practice. Anybody in the KM space or the knowledge management space, a community of practice is common individuals that share common functionality across the organization. So imagine a really large company that has divisions and there's project managers, but those project managers are in different divisions, so they don't talk. So they might want to create a COP or a community of practice where all the PMs share ideas with each other. So it's a form of a community that's based upon a work function. Okay. Interest groups, social, right? Community. Work project, pretty straightforward, right? We have projects, we have a collaborative group for a project. Workspace. Any guesses what a workspace is? It's all the stuff that's not above. That's what a workspace is. So this is our catch-all. So one of you guys might be going, hey, well, Kip, we have, I don't know, end of day budgets that we have to collaborate with a bunch of managers. Create a workspace. Create a workspace, invite the appropriate people, collaborate away. When it's done, we decommission it. So instead of compromising permissions of the other collaborative groups, we create cross-departmental collaboration. In this example, this client called them workspaces. Okay. And then the last one is external workspaces. We would flag these, and this is what you would have to be able to have guests within your team. So all the classifications above would not be able to allow you to have teams whatsoever or external guest access whatsoever, unless it was an external workspace. Now, with this said, can you enable sharing in your 365 tenant? Go to a file within HR and share it with someone in another department. And depending on your configurations, the answer is yes. That's your ad hoc way of, hey, I need to share this file with Ed. We need to work on it a little bit. I want to give his input. You might even configure sharing for those to expire in 30, 60 days. But that is better than one, emailing the file around, two, compromising the permissions of the HR site so Ed can co-author on a document, right? That is a much cleaner approach. And so that's the general approach that we take when we address that. So let me give you an example of this and I'll stop talking here. So here's an example actually of our tenant, Microsoft 365. Now, if you look here, you see common tech iconography that represents the teams down the left-hand side. One of those icons are departments. Another icon is what we call client spaces or project spaces. And then we have a channel that represents each of the projects for that given client. You'll see another icon there called 2022 Strategic Initiatives. Those are strategic, that's our workspace iconography. So we will actually not only classify teams, but we will brand them with unique iconography and depending on configurations, might even configure them differently or have an approval process. You'll notice on this previous slide, we identified for this client what is self-service versus what requires an approval process. And then what is the retention policy that is different based upon the classification, right? So a good summary of this, if you don't mind me hopping back over, is this little drop down. This is JourneyTEAM. We have projects, workspaces, external workspaces, departments, practices, sandbox, and communities. And all teams follow within one of those buckets. Okay. I know we're almost up at time. We have 1 minute questions, or Ed put a survey link in there. So take the survey. Ed, they're having a problem on the survey link.
Yeah, I'm looking at that to see what's going on. Hang on 1 second.
Oh, worked for Brian.
Oh,
Yeah, it's working for it. Maybe it's a slow load there, David. Yep. Okay. Questions in the chat in our no time that we have left. I'm okay actually staying on just a couple minutes if you guys had any particular questions, or if you wanted to and we run out of time, just put your questions in the chat and we can also even do a follow-up. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, David, get with me directly, or with Jasmine, and we will get you squared away.
It looks like David ended up getting in. He
Oh,
said it
cool.
loaded.
Oh, good. Perfect. Well, hey, thanks, folks. As Kip mentioned, he'll hang out for a minute. I'll hang out for a minute. If you have any questions, comments, considerations, we really do appreciate your feedback. We appreciate the participation. Hopefully you got some nuggets here that you can take away and start using today. And if you have follow-on questions, we try to be pretty easy to find. So thank you all.
Yeah, for sure. You guys asking about Team Hub, I can get you more information on Team Hub. I think, Jason, you had a question around sharing. For us, we're okay with it, right? But for a lot of our clients, I don't know about you guys, but Microsoft has placed that share button like everywhere, right? Like it's in Word, it's in Teams, it's in SharePoint, and I I don't feel as confident. I think it's too easy, to be honest with you. And so for some of our clients, what they'll do is they'll say, you could share in OneDrive, but maybe under structured sites, we reduce or we lock down sharing under structured sites and you just can't share. That's more extreme approach, but you do have some options there. But it really depends on the client and industry and all those other things. For us internally, we allow sharing. I've seen organizations where sharing is only allowed in OneDrive, and we restrict it on the departmental side and collaboration side. Or we say, hey, you want to collaborate with someone, you put it up in OneDrive temporarily, or you go create a workspace in Team Hub. And those are your options, right? I've even seen clients say that's what Box is for, and all secured stuff stays within our tenant, right? So there's many different options there, but hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay. All right, I think we're good, Ed.
All right, folks. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you in the next sessions.
All right, awesome. See you guys.